She leaned closer, unbuttoned just one button, and whispered with a smile, "You're curious now?" And I couldn't look away. It started with the mornings. I'd step out onto my small balcony to get coffee, and she would be there in her own little world, tending to her plants or sipping tea, sunlight spilling across her hair. At first, I thought it was just casual observation, a neighborly glance. But over the days, I noticed details that drew me in: how her fingers lingered on the leaves as she adjusted a flower, the faint tilt of her head when she squinted at the morning sun, and the way her laughter, soft and unassuming, floated across the fence and settled somewhere inside me. There was a quiet confidence in her that I couldn't ignore. She moved with ease, unself-consciously, her posture relaxed but undeniably graceful. It wasn't just the way she carried herself, it was the subtle strength in her presence, like she knew who she was and where she belonged in the world. And yet, there was vulnerability too, glimpsed in a pause, a sigh, or the way she would tuck a strand of hair behind her ear absent-mindedly, as if lost in thought. I found myself anticipating those moments. My curiosity wasn't just about attraction, it was the little human details that made her feel alive. The faint smell of her perfume that drifted on the breeze, floral and warm, lingered longer than the morning itself. Or the gentle hum of her voice as she spoke on the phone, completely unaware of me, yet somehow it made the air between our apartments feel charged. I noticed how her eyes softened when she smiled at a passerby, how her hands moved deliberately, almost ceremoniously, when watering the plants. I tried to keep it casual, passing glances through the window, nods when we crossed paths in the hallway, but there was a magnetic pull I couldn't ignore. I'd catch myself imagining what it would be like to speak to her for more than a few fleeting moments. To hear her laugh in response to something I said. To feel the subtle warmth of proximity rather than observing from a distance. My own heartbeat seemed to betray me every time our eyes met, even briefly. It wasn't just curiosity, it was admiration mixed with something deeper, a quiet fascination that grew every morning. I found comfort in the predictability of our routines, her morning tea, my coffee on the balcony, the small distance between us that somehow felt intimate. Each day, the anticipation built, a slow, simmering tension that I wasn't ready to name yet. And then, one day, I noticed a new detail, a playful glint in her eye, a smile that seemed to hold a secret just out of reach. I felt it before I saw it, the subtle invitation to be noticed, to lean in a little closer, to explore the curiosity that had been quietly growing inside me. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just neighborly admiration anymore. Something had shifted, imperceptibly at first, but unmistakably. I was drawn to her in a way that demanded attention. And I couldn't look away. Our first real conversation wasn't planned. I had been fixing a loose hinge on my apartment door when she appeared on her balcony, leaning lightly against the railing. She caught me looking, and instead of the awkwardness I expected, she smiled, a subtle, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. There was something teasing in it, a gentle challenge that I couldn't quite place, as if she had noticed the way my eyes lingered and decided to confront it without a word. "Struggling with that?" she asked, her voice smooth, calm, and warm, floating across the narrow gap between our apartments. I blinked, startled, fumbling with the hinge. Yeah, a little." She laughed softly, the sound bright and easy, like sunlight bouncing off water. "Need a hand?" Her tone wasn't just helpful, it carried an invitation, subtle but unmistakable, that made my fingers tighten around the screwdriver. When I glanced up, she leaned slightly closer over the balcony railing. The morning sun hit her just right, catching the soft strands of hair falling around her face. Her eyes were calm but alert, watching me, gauging my reaction. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, my heart picking up a rhythm I couldn't control. There was something playful in the way she held herself, yet so natural that it didn't feel contrived. "Thanks, but I think I've got it," I managed, trying to sound confident, while secretly hoping she would stay longer. Her lips curved into a small, teasing smile, and for a moment she said nothing, letting the silence stretch. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, a gentle tension that made the air feel heavier. She tilted her head, a subtle gesture, her gaze catching mine for just a second longer than necessary. I noticed the way her hand rested lightly on the railing, the soft lines of her fingers, the way her sleeve slipped slightly, revealing the curve of her wrist. My attention was riveted, caught on details that didn't matter to anyone else but somehow defined the moment entirely. "You always look so serious," she said finally, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The movement was casual, but it made the space between us feel smaller, warmer, more intimate. Her voice carried a hint of amusement, teasing me without words. I realized I was smiling, almost involuntarily, feeling that strange, magnetic pull toward her. Our interaction ended with a friendly nod and a soft wave, but the tension lingered, invisible yet palpable. I found myself replaying every gesture, every glance, over and over. The way she had leaned, the light in her eyes, the subtle playfulness of her tone, it all built a quiet connection, unspoken but undeniable. That morning, I understood something crucial. She had noticed me noticing her, and she wasn't intimidated or dismissive. Instead, she engaged with a light, teasing energy that made me question my own hesitation. The seed of curiosity she had planted wasn't just about attraction. It was about an invitation into her world, an unspoken challenge to step closer, to lean into the tension that neither of us had yet named. And as I watched her retreat to her apartment, I knew I was already anticipating the next encounter, the next small moment where the quiet, playful tension would ripple between us once more. It was a quiet evening, the kind that made the city feel softer, calmer, almost private. I had been reading on my balcony when I noticed her sitting by the window, a book in her hands. The warm glow from the lamp behind her haloed her hair, and for a moment, she looked impossibly serene. Then, as if noticing me through the faintly drawn curtain, she smiled, not the casual, neighborly smile of before, but something lighter, more deliberate, with a spark of mischief tucked in the corners of her eyes. I felt my heartbeat shift, a mix of anticipation and hesitation. My gaze flickered away instinctively, yet I couldn't stop returning it. That was when she moved slightly, rising from the chair and walking toward the window. She stopped, leaned casually against the sill, and for just a moment, her posture relaxed in a way that made the air between us seem charged. Then she did something small but deliberate. Her fingers traced the edge of her blouse near the collar, and with a subtle, fluid motion, she unbuttoned just one button. My chest tightened, an almost painful awareness of her presence washing over me. It wasn't overt or provocative, it was quiet, teasing, playful. It was an invitation wrapped in elegance. "You're curious now?" she asked softly, tilting her head, her lips curving into that same mischievous smile that had haunted my thoughts for days. The words struck me with more force than I expected. Curiosity, yes, but it wasn't just about her appearance. It was the ease she carried herself with, the confidence that made the moment feel intimate without crossing a line. I felt a magnetic pull, the tension in the space between us almost tangible, like a current running just beneath the surface of a calm pond. I hesitated. My mind raced with questions, with caution, with the awareness of the space separating us. Yet there was something magnetic in the way she held my attention. Her eyes met mine steadily, patiently, giving me permission to linger, to notice, to feel without pressure. Her hand rested lightly against the window frame, fingers relaxed, yet purposeful, anchoring her in the moment. I swallowed hard, aware of the small shift in air, of the soft hum of the city around us, of the faint scent of her perfume that seemed to drift on the warm evening breeze. The invitation wasn't just the unbuttoned fabric, it was the gentle challenge to lean closer, to engage with a tension that was both exhilarating and safe. I found myself stepping a fraction nearer, not physically crossing her threshold, but emotionally opening, letting my curiosity meet hers in quiet acknowledgement. The unspoken understanding hung between us, unhurried, deliberate, the kind of intimacy that only grows from trust and subtlety. That night, I realized the nature of our connection had shifted. It was no longer about observing from a distance or wondering what might be. It was about the playful, quiet invitation she extended and my decision to engage with it, however tentatively. And in that moment, every glance, every pause, every almost touch held weight, promising that the slow burn of our connection was only just beginning. After that evening, something shifted between us, subtle but undeniable. The tension that had been playful and teasing became something warmer, more human, rooted in curiosity but branching into trust. I found myself seeking small ways to be near her, not intrusively, just enough to notice the way her presence altered the space around me. And she seemed to do the same, leaving little traces of invitation, a smile that lingered a second too long, a casual question that prompted conversation, a shared glance that carried the weight of unspoken understanding. One rainy afternoon, she appeared at my door, an umbrella dripping raindrops onto the welcome mat. She looked unexpectedly vulnerable, hair damp, a stray lock clinging to her cheek. "Mind if I come in?" she asked, voice soft, carrying a note of tiredness I hadn't heard before. I nodded, stepping aside. She entered, shaking off the rain, leaving a faint scent of fresh air and perfume lingering in the room. We settled near the window, watching the rain blur the city lights. She brought tea, handed me a cup, and our fingers brushed. It was brief, accidental, or maybe not, but it sparked a warmth that spread quickly from my hand to my chest. For a moment, we simply sat together, quiet except for the soft patter of rain. The intimacy wasn't in words but in proximity, in the shared comfort of being seen without pretense. Then she spoke, hesitating slightly, as if testing the waters of disclosure. "Sometimes I forget how small the world can feel," she said. Her eyes, usually so confident, softened with a flicker of loneliness. "Even when people are around, it's easy to feel disconnected." I felt an urge to bridge that gap, to let her know she wasn't alone. "I know that feeling," I admitted, keeping my voice low. "It's like you're surrounded by noise, but no one actually hears you." Her gaze lingered on me, eyes searching, vulnerable, and for the first time I noticed the quiet weight behind her confidence. There was wisdom there, yes, but also scars, moments of doubt and isolation she didn't usually reveal. And somehow, sharing that space, admitting my own vulnerability, made the moment feel profoundly intimate. We talked for a while, not in the frantic way of friends trying to catch up, but in a slow, deliberate exchange where each word mattered. She laughed softly at small memories, I shared awkward stories from my youth, and the room felt warmer, more alive, because of the honesty between us. There was no need for grand gestures. The connection was in the lingering glances, the gentle brush of her hand against mine when reaching for the teapot, the quiet acknowledgement in our smiles. By the time the rain had eased, I felt a closeness that went beyond attraction. This was about trust, about letting someone see the unguarded parts of yourself and being met with acceptance. And as she prepared to leave, the warmth of her presence stayed with me, the memory of that quiet, shared vulnerability lingering long after the door closed behind her. For the first time, I realized that our connection was no longer just playful curiosity. It was becoming something deeper, a slow-burning intimacy rooted in emotional honesty, mutual respect, and the small, meaningful touches that said far more than words ever could. A few days after our rainy afternoon together, the energy between us had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. There was a tension now, one that existed in the space between our casual greetings, in the way she lingered near me just long enough to make me aware of her presence, in the unspoken invitations carried by a glance or a brush of the hand. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was constant, a quiet hum in the background of every encounter. One evening, I found myself helping her carry groceries from the lobby to her apartment. She insisted on doing most of the work, but I reached for a heavy bag at the same time she did. Our hands met over the canvas strap, fingers brushing, and I felt a jolt, a pulse of awareness that made my heart skip. She looked at me then, eyes calm, unflustered, but with the faintest curve of a smile playing on her lips. That smile carried understanding, a recognition of the tiny moment we both knew had weight. We walked together up the narrow stairwell, steps synchronized, and I was acutely aware of the closeness, the warmth radiating from her shoulder as it occasionally brushed mine, the subtle scent of her perfume lingering in the enclosed space. I wanted to speak, to fill the silence, but words felt inadequate. Instead, I focused on her presence, absorbing every detail, The soft rustle of her blouse, the gentle sway of her hair, the way her breath seemed to match the rhythm of my own. By the time we reached her door, I was acutely conscious of the heightened awareness between us. It wasn't about desire in a physical sense. It was the magnetism of attention, the electricity of shared space, the awareness of every fleeting touch and glance. She opened her door slowly, letting it swing just enough to invite me in, or perhaps to let me linger outside. Our eyes met, and there was a quiet acknowledgement. Both of us knew the tension, both of us felt it, and neither wanted to disturb it recklessly. Then, as if to remind me of the delicate line we were walking, she leaned slightly toward me to set down the groceries. Our hands brushed again, longer this time, almost lingering. I could feel the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of our sleeves, the subtle pulse of her energy, the quiet steadiness of her presence. My pulse raced, my mind scrambled for composure, yet I didn't pull away. There was trust in that closeness, even in the charged tension, and I wanted to respect it while feeling it fully. "Careful," she said softly, almost teasingly, as our fingers separated. "Or you'll get distracted." Her tone was light, but I felt the weight beneath it, the acknowledgement of what simmered between us. I realized then that the tension wasn't a problem to solve. It was a space to inhabit, to savor slowly, to learn from. As I stepped back to leave, I carried with me a heightened sense of awareness that lingered long after the door closed. Every glance, every touch, every pause we shared became etched in memory. It was intoxicating, not in a rush or a blaze, but in the slow, deliberate fire of recognition and connection, an intimacy that demanded attention, patience, and restraint, and left me both exhilarated and grounded in ways I hadn't anticipated. After the heightened tension of our earlier encounters, the next few days were suffused with a quiet, comfortable intimacy. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions, it was in the small, deliberate acts that spoke volumes. I found myself noticing the way she moved through her apartment when I visited, how she'd pause to adjust a book on the shelf or hum softly to herself, and each gesture drew me in further, not as a fleeting attraction, but as genuine admiration for the rhythm of her presence. That evening, she invited me to join her for tea on the balcony. The city lights stretched out below, distant and warm, while the night air carried the faint scent of jasmine from her plants. She had placed 2 steaming cups on the small table between us. As I reached for mine, our fingers brushed lightly, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. The warmth of her touch traveled subtly, a quiet echo in my chest. We sat close, close enough that our knees nearly touched. There was a comforting rhythm to the silence between us, punctuated by soft laughter and gentle conversation. She reached for the sugar bowl, her hand lightly brushing mine again, and I felt the slow, grounding pull of her presence. It was no longer the teasing tension of before. It was familiarity, trust, and warmth blending seamlessly. At one point, she adjusted the collar of my shirt, her fingers resting briefly against my shoulder. The gesture was casual, natural, but the intimacy of it wasn't lost on me. My heartbeat quickened, but not from anxiety, rather, from the comforting awareness that this connection was mutual, grounded in trust rather than fleeting curiosity. She leaned slightly closer, her shoulder brushing mine, and I felt the quiet steadiness of her being, a reassurance that spoke louder than words. We talked about trivial things, the weather, our favorite books, shared memories of mundane life. But even in these ordinary topics, there was a depth. Her voice carried a calm warmth, and I found myself listening not just to her words, but to the cadence, the subtle inflections, the way she lingered on a thought just long enough for me to feel included in her inner world. The intimacy wasn't overt. It was in the steady eye contact, the small smiles exchanged across the table, and the way her presence seemed to settle a restless part of me I hadn't fully acknowledged. As the evening drew on, I realized that our connection had grown into something steady and enduring. There was no need for rush or drama. She reached over to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear, her fingers brushing softly against my cheek, and I felt the quiet resolution of our slow burn tension. It was complete, not in a rush, not with fireworks, but in a steady, warm acknowledgement of mutual affection and understanding. When I finally left, she lingered at the door, a small smile playing on her lips. Our fingers met briefly in parting, and the warmth remained long after the door closed. That night, I understood the depth of what we had built, a slow, deliberate intimacy, founded on trust, playful curiosity, and shared vulnerability. The tension that had once drawn me in was no longer urgent, it had softened into something enduring, tender, and profoundly human. The days following our quiet balcony evening were marked by a calm intimacy that felt natural and unforced. We no longer needed the teasing glances or subtle challenges. The tension had softened into a steady warmth, like sunlight spilling slowly across a room. Each interaction carried with it a sense of ease, a shared understanding that had grown from our slow, deliberate connection. One afternoon, she invited me over to help rearrange some books on her living room shelf. The task itself was mundane, but the way we moved through the space together made it intimate. Our hands brushed occasionally, each touch lingering just long enough to make me aware of her presence, yet gentle enough to maintain comfort and trust. I felt her proximity like a quiet current, steady and grounding. When a book slipped from my hands, she caught it effortlessly, her fingers grazing mine as she passed it back. There was a pause, just long enough for our eyes to meet, and in that fleeting moment, the playfulness of our early interactions returned, softened now by the depth of mutual respect and understanding. The tension was no longer about desire alone. It was about awareness, connection, and the shared joy of being present with someone who truly saw you. We moved to sit by the window, sunlight casting a warm glow on her hair and face. She reached over to adjust my sleeve, a simple gesture that carried the weight of tenderness. I could feel the warmth of her hand through the thin fabric, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was no rush, no pressure, only the quiet acknowledgement of what had grown between us, a bond built on trust, curiosity, and emotional honesty. She laughed softly at something I said, the sound gentle and comforting, and I found myself leaning slightly closer, drawn not by impatience but by the natural rhythm of companionship. She mirrored my movement, subtly decreasing the space between us until our shoulders brushed. It was a small, deliberate closeness, yet it carried a depth that words could not capture. The warmth of her presence seeped into me, steadying my heartbeat and calming my restless thoughts. By the time I stood to leave, the connection between us felt complete in its quiet way. She walked me to the door, her hand briefly resting on mine in farewell, a lingering touch that spoke volumes. "Until next time," she said softly, a smile playing on her lips, carrying the promise of more shared moments. As I stepped back into the hallway, I realized the journey we had shared, from fleeting curiosity to playful tension, from shared vulnerability to quiet affection, had culminated in something profoundly human. The slow burn of our connection had reached emotional harmony, a balance of trust, warmth, and mutual understanding. There were no dramatic declarations, no rushed confessions, only the satisfaction of knowing that our bond was real, steady, and enduring. Walking back to my apartment, I felt the lingering warmth of her presence, a quiet comfort that stayed with me long after the door closed. The story of us was complete, not in a blaze of passion, but in the subtle, tender moments that made each day brighter, each glance more meaningful, and each touch a reminder that slow, deliberate intimacy could be as powerful and fulfilling as any grand gesture.